Are you able to see my screen? Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. So good morning to all of you. So yesterday I was just discussing about the various iteratives in Ruby on Rails and the concept of substitution and some small brief information about the pattern matching. Today we will see about what is Rails and how we can use it. Okay, so in the previous classes I have told that Ruby is the programming language, okay, object oriented programming language, whereas the Rails is the framework. So you are going to execute the Ruby programming language on the Rails framework. So Ruby and Rails goes hand in hand. So Ruby has to be executed only on the framework, that is Rails framework. So what is Rails? Rails is a productive web application framework. So what do you mean by web application? Okay, so any kind of applications which you run on the server, okay, which will have one tier, two tier, or n tier. So you can have a three tier architecture in the Rails framework. So that is possible. Okay, but you cannot design a very vast and extensive enterprise application, but definitely you can have a simple web application with three tier architecture. This framework is written by David Hansen. Okay, so which is least 10 times faster with Rails that you could do with a typical Java framework. What is the specialty about this Rails framework is you have got lot of inbuilt utilities where it is only a plug and play. So making your application program to run faster. Okay, so if you are taking the Java framework, so you have to have a lot of supporting files explicitly that needs to be installed when you are running it. So, but that kind of things are not there in the Rails framework. More or less, all kinds of the supporting files are there in the Rails framework. And moreover, it is an open source framework for developing database backed web applications. Probably at this point of time, you would be knowing that the difficulties or the intrinsic challenges that you have faced in servlets and JSPs. Okay, you have to do a lot of configurations, go to the servlet mapping, give the servlet tags and all those things. Okay, this kind of things will not be available here. And point number two is you have to create the front end interface. Okay, then you have to create the tables, then you have to start the server, and there should be a linear mapping between all these things. Okay, so the program which you are going to write should be deployed in the server explicitly. So if it's IDE, procedure is different. If you are going to explicitly install the web server or any other application server, it is different. Next, code and database scheme are called as the configuration. That means there is a direct mapping and integration between your code, your server, and your database. More than anything else, you don't have this compilation phase. So, in either in servlets or JSPs, the compilation phase is there. Okay, so if you are using a servlet, you have to explicitly you have to compile it because it is a class file. But if you are taking the JSP file, you need not do any compilation, but at the back end there will be a compilation which will be going on. So only after the compilation of class only you can execute your JSP. That means either in servlets or JSP, which is there in the Java framework, requires compilation. Okay, that means there is a possibility that there might be compile time errors. Okay, but here it is not like this. So there is no compilation phase. So when there is no compilation phase, the scripts execute faster than the Java framework. So that is the meaning of this. Okay, so Rails is best suited for developing the database with a web application. Okay. Next, as I said earlier, it follows model, view, and controller. What is model? Model is nothing but your data. So whatever the data that you are going to put into your application framework, not application framework, you call that data processing entity as model. Next, view already you have seen, so it is used to display the results. That means whatever the processing, the outcome of the processing will be displayed in the view architecture. Next is the controller. Controller is control the application. Say for example, you take a simple application, say login. Okay, it's a very simple web page, and for any application, for any web application, there are different stakeholders. Say for example, if you take a ERP with respect to the higher education, you will have a vice chancellor entering to see some results. Okay, then the principal entering to the same portal will have a different role and responsibilities. HODs will be having a different role and responsibility with the same user interface, and faculty members will be having the different user interface. And the students, when they are logging with the with the different semesters, they will be having the different views. That means in the same application, there are different stakeholders. When they log in, so corresponding to their roles, so you are going to get the different pages. So that is what I mean to say as a controller. So you in the application, you will have a provision to control depending upon the role and responsibility of the stakeholders. So similarly, okay, so similarly, what happens if you are taking the software application to be developed, which is given by client, you will have your project manager, you have a team lead, you will have a software developer, you have a testing analyst. So there are different stakeholders will be available. So when they log into the same application, they will have the different views. So this controller entity will give that kind of a view for different holders. So that is the meaning of controller. Now, so what is this MVC architecture? It is an approach of connecting your object-oriented software with the relational database. But nowadays, people are not at all using a relational database. They are going for the object-oriented database like Oracle, 13G, Sybase, Informix. Okay, so like that higher end versions of database, they are moving on. Okay, next. So it uses object-oriented relational mappings. Okay, so that means what all object-oriented features that are available will be mapped to the Ruby programming language. So this already I have explained you, which maps tables to classes, rows to objects, columns to fields of objects. So I told you if you are creating the user interface. So in my previous class, when I was explaining about that Ruby Rail program for the book information, okay, so whatever the fields that you are going to create, for that all the typical operations will be created dynamically. So basically, which maps the tables to classes. So in the Rails framework, we call it as classes. In the Ruby, we call it as tables. So in the Rails, we call it as objects. In the Ruby, we call it as rows. In the Rails, we call it as objects. The Ruby, we call it as columns. So correspondingly, it is going to map. Are you getting the points? Respond?
Yes, sir, we are getting.
Okay, fine. Okay. Next is a full stack framework. Probably you'll be knowing what is the significance of full stack development. Right from the requirement drafting till deploying the entire application into a server with various phases is nothing but your full stack, which includes your application being built by using corresponding technologies, your database server, your testing softwares, okay, and other network configuration tools. So everything will come under the umbrella of what is called as full stack. Okay, so it is possible to design and develop such kind of applications on Rails framework using the programming language. Okay, which programming language? I mean to say it is Ruby. Okay, so and this Ruby supports all kinds of this 7 layers with like application, presentation, session, data link layers, and all those things. And there is a seamless integration or the information flow between these various layers. So you need not write much code. So probably you would have written a code in servlets or JSPs. Okay, but if you same thing, if you just try to write it in Ruby, it is very less when compared to the servlets or JSP for writing the database applications. The cohesion is very less when compared to Java programming. Okay, and of course it requires a few lines of code, and you can also have a lot of inbuilt XML configuration files which will take care automatically when you are using that scaffold utility. Okay, so I mean to say here, so there are a lot of inbuilt utilities available in the Rails framework, okay, to do all those things. Okay, so this is about the full stack framework. So here my objective is to tell you that the Rails with Ruby can provide the full stack framework. Okay, so next is what are the strengths of Rails? Today the takeaway from this class is what are the strengths of Rails? Please make a note of this. The first one is meta programming. It's a very important question. Explain the strengths of Rails. The first one is meta programming. Second is active record. Third is convention over configuration. Fourth is scaffolding. Fifth is built-in testing. Sixth is 3 environments. Okay, next is yeah, so that's all. Okay, these are the strengths of Rails. What are those? Meta programming, active record, convention over configuration, next is scaffolding, fifth is built-in testing, sixth is 3 environments. Okay, first we will see what is this meta programming. So I guess you would be knowing the concept of what is metadata. So data describing other data is called as metadata. But here we talk about programming. So when you tell that data about data means, so the new data is going to give the information out of the existing data. So what is the meaning of this? That means here you are using some data to process some other data. So data is what? It's a raw data. So in this case, the raw data is the older one. So and the new data, from that you are going to extract some kind of the information. What is information? It is a processed data. Okay, so here we are going to talk about what is called as meta programming. Okay, so that means you are writing one program which can read, analyze, generalize, do processing of other programs. Okay, one program analyzes the other programming. Suppose say if you have two programs, X program and Y program. Okay, X program can analyze the Y program. The code would have been written in such a way that the X program can analyze the output of the Y program. So that is called as a meta programming. Say for example, this is a very general trend in machine learning. You write an algorithm and that algorithm reads the core features or core functionalities of the other programming. So this is extensively used in predictive analytics. It is extensively used in prescriptive analytics, then other machine learning algorithms, soft computing, deep learning, data science, etc. Okay, so what basically it does? Okay, it uses some programs to write other programs. Okay, so that means there will be some kind of the code generation. Say in this case, suppose I create a fields in the database through a table. I create a table which has fields called as student ID, student name, student address, and say student marks. So once I create these four fields in my database through the table, whatever the typical transaction that needs to happen on these fields will be automatically generated. So you can add student details, you can delete student details, you can update students details. See, these are the codes which are generated in the backend. You are not going to write the code for doing all these things. But whereas in in other programming language, you are going to write the code for doing all these operations. But in the Rails framework, it provides a feature called as metaprogramming, which will help you to read. If you just create these fields in the database, automatically at the back end, a code will be generated. Okay, that is what I mean to say metaprogramming. And the Rails uses this capability very well. Okay, so that is what is called as metaprogramming. One programming reading the other programming. Okay, to be more precise, for example, I guess you would have known something about testing. Yes or no?
Sir.
You know what is testing, right? And there are different kinds of testing. So once the requirements comes into the application, into the company, the people write a SRS, that is software requirement specification document, and they define what are the functional requirements of that project, and that functional requirements will be an input for the testing team. So based on the functional requirements of the from the testing team, the test manager starts writing the test plan. So based on the test plan, the people start writing test cases. What test cases? It is manual test cases. Okay, in order to write the manual test cases, they design a test strategy. That means how to do the testing. For each functional requirement, the people start writing n number of test cases. Okay, so all these test cases are written manually and they are going to check it. And there will be a dedicated team to do the testing after the application is being built. So, and you know, the 60% of the total time goes for testing to have the stability in the applications. Now, what happens? Say there's one application X, and there are 60 people who will be executing the test cases for that functional requirement. Assume it may take 2 months or 3 months. Okay, instead of me doing this, having the 60 people to do test cases, why don't I write a script or a program by which when the functional requirement is already being implemented application, that application I will just give it as an input. The entire application I will give it to an input to a testing tool, and testing tool must be able to predict and test without the human intervention. Okay, so without the human intervention, the program must be able to do the test by itself. Okay, so that is what I mean to say metaprogramming. This kind of feature is available in Rails framework. Okay, this is just an example to understand what is metaprogramming. Okay, suppose say you are writing a simple C code. Okay, I want to test all possibilities. I don't give the inputs. My programming itself should take different inputs and test whether it is complying with all kinds of requirements or not. So this is what is metaprogramming is. Okay. Next, ActiveRecord. ActiveRecord is the another feature which is used. Okay, which saves the objects to the database. So what are these objects? Objects are nothing but your field names. What are those field names? The table you would have created some field name like student ID, student name. Okay, student address, phone number, etc. Those are fields. These fields will be converted to the objects in the database. Okay, so in the previous thing I have told you, this Rails maps tables to classes, rows to objects, and columns to the field of objects. Okay, so now here this active records provides a way to map objects to the database. Okay, that means the schema will be generated automatically at the backend using this meta programming. So I was just showing in the previous program. So once you give that to book infos, if you remember that word, okay, book infos, so automatically that new when you click on that hyperlink, so it will give you the label name and it will create a text field. Okay, so that means all these things will be converted into the object directly. You are not writing any HTML program to create that kind of interface. So the scaffold utility will give some kind of a direction through this active record by the implementation of meta programming. Okay. Next, point number 3, that is convention over configuration. In most of the other frameworks, it may be a .NET or it might be a J2E framework, etc. Or you require some kind of the configuration. But Rail does not need much configuration. Of course, it requires some configuration, but it's very, very minimal when compared to other category of frameworks. Next, scaffolding. Okay, so scaffolding is a utility which actually creates some kind of a code in the early stages of the development. Okay, so that means when I was talking about this uh, the scaffold utility, once you create a fields, so what fields, if you look at the previous example, like we have created some book ID, book name, book author, book publisher, book edition, and all those things. Once you create those things, a front end, the required transactions that needs to be done. What is this required transactions? It can be deleting, it can be updating, or it can be an editing, okay, or it can be an inserting. So this I call it as transactions. So this for to carry out these transactions on these fields, automatically at the back end the code will be generated. Okay, so that scaffold utility provides these features. Next, built-in testing. So built-in testing, Rail creates simple automated tests, so that helps you to extend. So you would have seen in the diagrams or in the pictures which I have shown in the previous class, that built within this many number of seconds, okay, or executed in this many number of seconds. You can see in every stage when the process is happening for executing the web application on this Rails framework, so testing goes on parallelly for that specific step. That means there is a built-in testing for each kind of transactions that you do in the Ruby framework. Okay, so this is the next feature. Next is you have these 3 environments. What are those 3 environments? You have development, you have testing, and you have production. There are 3 kinds of environments where this Ruby programming language is executed on the Rails framework. Whatever the typical coding that you do it in the controller, so that part maps to what is called the development, because you are going to write only the business logic. For example, you want to search based on some book ID, so only that 2-3 lines of code only you have to write it. Okay, that means there will be a development phase explicitly done for the application in the Rails framework. Second is at the same time you are also doing the testing. That means whenever you try to execute one command in the command prompt for developing the web application, okay, so at each point of time the testing, what testing, this is called nothing but the unit testing. Okay, whether it is conforming to the requirements of the Rails framework. Okay, that every time this testing phase will be available. Next is production. So I've done with my code. Okay, then I've done it with my testing phases in each of these steps, and I told you in the previous class also thus that these steps for building the web applications are sequential in nature. Okay, so if you just try to alter the sequence of executing it, then it may create a problem. So you have to follow the typical sequential order. So development is done, testing is done, then you have to do the production. What is production? Production is nothing but you are deploying. So deploying where? Deploying in the server. Which server? Okay, it is the default server for executing the web application in the Rails framework is WebRick. WebRick is a server which is used to execute your web applications on the Rails framework. So you have to make sure that you are running your Apache Tomcat server and your WebRick server, which basically runs on two different ports. One is 8080, this is Apache Tomcat server, and the second is your 3000. That is WebRick server. It is going to execute on this specific folder. So that means there are two servers which will be executing to make your web application running append. Okay. So whatever application that you write, so that needs to be deployed in the server. Deployed means you have to put that entire application into a specific folder. So that we call it as a production. The beauty of this development, testing, and production environment is, so whenever you try to change anything, automatically the changed one will automatically get reflected in all these phases automatically. You need not again go and do the same thing. Okay, so which will reduce your time. But if you are looking at the other frameworks, say for example, if you are taking J2 servlet and you are trying to write, you would have written the servlet programming. If you have any changes that needs to be done, you should go back to your code, do the changes, again compile, recompile, redeploy. Okay, which will take that time. But if you look at the JSP, in JSP what happens, you just right click, edit, do the changes, the classes will get recompiled at the backend, and you can at the fresh you can execute the JSP program. So JSP programs are little bit faster, only little bit faster when compared to servlets. But when compared to JSPs, servlets, EJBs, so Ruby is more flexible and more faster than these things. Okay. Okay. So is this clear to you? What are the features of Rails? The question may be explain the Rails strengths or explain the features of Rails. So that means you have to write this specific points: meta programming, ActiveRecord, configuration, scaffolding, okay, and testing, and 3 environments. Okay. Any questions? And any clarifications here? Anybody?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Okay. Okay, next is the dynamic documents. Okay, so all the Ruby code must be enclosed between the opening of closing of this tags. Okay, so if you put anything between this opening and closing of this tags, okay, are called as Ruby code. Okay, which can be interpreted in the execution process, where all the data written within this Ruby code will be written by the browser, and all these computations, like computation in the sense the searching a book, okay, which I defined in the controllers, right, the previous class. So those are called as Ruby code. So any code which is being put in the opening and closing of these tags are called as Ruby code. But the same thing if you are going to put it in JSP servlets, so it is called as a scriptlet tags. Now what is this controller? So controller is very important. So which is the logical center for your application, because that is like heart of your applications, which coordinates between the various users, views and the model. So controller basically coordinates the users here, nothing but your browser. Okay, and of course with the browser you will have a different stakeholders to interact with the applications. Next, it is responsible for routing the external requests to internal actions, which handles URLs extremely well. That means from one page to another page. So, for example, day before yesterday in the example I was showing, so once you insert, you can edit, you can update, you can delete. So appropriately, it is going to the respective web pages. So you are not going to create any controls in it. So it can automatically understand where to go when you are going to click on the specific buttons. Okay, which can, and it manages caching also. You know what is caching? Okay, so which can be applications order of magnitude to performance the to boost the performance of the application, and which manages the various capabilities that is available. Okay, see, for this is actually the structure. Once you create a controller, no, book controller, assume I am creating a by name book. So in my previous class, I given that book infos. Suppose if I had given book, so it is going to create like this a book controller. Okay, and in book controller, that list to show new and all these things will be implemented. This is you just I can understand like an interface. Okay, so once you create a controller, automatically all the required interfaces, okay, will be available for those fields which you have created the database. Okay, what is the interface? In the interface, you are just going to declare a method. You are not going to define. The definitions will be done at the dynamic time. Okay. See now, for example, once you create a controller, this structure will be created. DefineList. So when you use a scaffold utility, this code will be generated. At books is equal to book find all. That means what? When you want to see the results of all the books that are there in the database, only this part of code is sufficient to execute. This code is not written by you. Okay, so the definition for this will be done by the code automatically. That is what I mean to say. Mapping the tables to classes, columns to objects, etc. Okay. Similarly, show method can based on the book ID, if I want to display the list of all the books based on the title, this code will be generated. So like this, for each of the transactions, okay, it is going to create the methods like this. Okay. So you can just go through this document once, okay, to display the required information, and also I showcased some of the iteratives also yesterday. You can see this is additional things which you can write it. You can see here all the codes which are written will be in the opening and closing of this script letter. This is all these things are done extra apart from the basic text. Okay. So when you want to give an hyperlink, you can give something like this. Okay, so percentage equal to link to add new book. Actually, this is all this being generated automatically, and if you want to write, you can write your own code also. Okay, so in the Rails directory, if demo is my name of my application, under demo you will have all these apps created. What are those things? App, layers, components, and all those things will be created. So here under app, controller, helpers, models, views, labels, config, database, all the corresponding files will be automatically generated when you use that Rails-D. Okay, so this is all inbuilt. Okay, this is all inbuilt components which will be generated. So once you install your Rails program, I mean to say your Rails software, and just to follow those commands, so you can see all these folders will be created automatically. Okay, so this is the basic things that are required to execute any Ruby program with respect to a database from Rails framework perspective. So that's all for today. If you have any clarifications, let me know. So answer your attendance. Asta,
Present, sir.
Abhinav,
Present, sir.
Aishwarya,
Present, sir.
Amrisha, Anu, Arbas, Arjun,
Present, sir.
Ashok,
Present, sir.
Benita,
Benita present, sir.
Bhargavi, Bhavisha,
Present, sir.
Chaitra,
Present, sir.
Devamalya,
Present, sir.
Diksha,
Present, sir.
Deepika,
Present, sir.
Deepika MB,
Present, sir.
Murli Krishna,
Present, sir.
Gangubai,
Present, sir.
Guria,
Present, sir.
Arshit,
Present, sir.
Junjar,
Present, sir.
Kavya,
Present, sir.
Kishore,
Present, sir.
Lata,
Yes, sir.
Manisha,
Present, sir.
Manjunath,
Yes, sir.
Nayana, Nilanjan,
Yes, sir.
Nishant,
Present, sir.
Pavitra,
Present, sir.
Maithili,
Present, sir.
Priyanka,
Present, sir.
Akash.
Sir, Pawan present, sir.
Okay. Akash,
Present, sir.
Rajeshwari,
Present, sir.
Rakesha,
Present, sir.
Ramya,
Present, sir.
Rashmi,
Present, sir.
Ravi Shankar,
Yes, sir.
Rizwan,
Present, sir.
Vishal,
Present, sir.
Savita, Savita,
Yes, sir.
Shruti,
Present, sir.
Sneha, Spurti,
Present, sir.
Srinidhi,
Present, sir.
Srinivas, Sunil,
Sir, present, sir.
Vaishnavi,
Present, sir.
Vinny.
Present, sir.
Yeah, okay. So we'll meet next class. Any clarification is there? Please chat it, put it in the chat window. Any clarifications that you have? Okay.
Sir Bhargavi present, sir.